All right, good evening, everyone. We're going to start in a couple of minutes. We're just going to give people a little time to get logged in, and then we'll start in about 2 minutes. All right, we're going to get started now. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm just going to go over some housekeeping things before we get into our presentation. So tonight our presentation is going to be recorded, and after the presentation you'll get a link to download this within the next 24 hours. You'll also get the slides of the presentation so you can take notes later on if you want to rewatch the recording. Everyone has been automatically muted during the presentation. However, if you have a question, there is on the side panel, you can raise your hand to ask a question, or you can use the chat feature to send us a message with your question, and we will have time at the end of the presentation to go over any questions that you may have. And so now I'm going to jump into the presentation. We actually I have one of my colleagues on with us this evening, Hector. He is a social worker, a geriatric care manager, and we will be doing this presentation together tonight. But before I go any further, I do need to let you know that the information we present tonight is for information purposes only. It's not to be relied on as legal advice. And of course, for anyone's particular circumstances, you should talk to an attorney directly to get legal advice based on your circumstances. Tonight we're going to talk a lot about Medicaid. There are a lot of new rules coming down in the near future. They're set to go into effect this October. And this is a result of a very large budget deficit that New York has. Medicaid coverage is always under the microscope. They're always looking for ways to cut the budget, save money, and this time Medicaid was on the chopping block. Luckily, we have about 5 to 6 months before these changes go into effect. So we will have a little bit of runway left to do some planning for clients that need services where we can get them eligible under the old rules. So tonight we'll talk about the rules that are currently in place and how you can qualify under those rules. And then we'll talk about the new rules that are coming in October and what we can do when they go into place to help people become eligible for Medicaid services. So those are these are the three topics that we'll be talking about. And I'm going to turn it over now to Hector to talk about the current Medicaid structure and the new changes, and then I will close us out with the planning strategies that many clients use to help them become eligible. So Hector, do you want to take it from here?
Absolutely, Alyssa. Thank you. And I look forward to shedding some light on the existing program, obviously, and most people should be familiar with most of the rules, but there are major changes coming in October. And that's why we felt it was very important to have these webinars to give information and give some explanation of what the potential changes are going to be and how it's going to impact Medicaid eligibility. I've been working in the Medicaid arena for nearly 25 years and in home care. And the changes that are happening in October are probably some of the most major changes that I've experienced in my career. So we're all kind of going to see what's going to happen in October and how we all can get through these changes together and plan for providing services under Medicaid for our loved ones. As Alyssa indicated, the first part of the presentation is essentially looking at the current Medicaid structure. Medicaid is a very large program, as most of you know. It's a federal program that's funded 50% by the federal government, 50% by this, 25% by the state, and 25% by the local community or county. It's a huge program that essentially has many, many parts. And the main areas that we work with are the institutional Medicaid program, which is the nursing home portion, and community-based Medicaid, as most people refer to as home care services. Currently, most people that I speak with, most clients that approach me about applying for Medicaid, always kind of know there's a look back period. And that is true in the institutional Medicaid arena. There is a 5-year look back in terms of transfers that were done during that period of time. About 10 years ago, when the rules were changed, the penalty period used to be at the point of the transfer. That's when they started to calculate when the penalty for Medicaid for institutional care would begin. However, about 10 years ago, the look back period changed to 5 years, and the point of the penalty based on the transfers was at the point of admission into nursing home care. So it took a lot of planning to make sure that if there was a penalty, that it would not be as too egregious and avoid having to wait a number of years until Medicaid kicked in for institutional care. In the home care arena, there really was no look back period at all. Families were always surprised by that. And essentially, when you submit an application, all that Medicaid requires is 3 months of banking. And even if the banking is above the Medicaid limits and resources, the application was based on the last month of the banking of the last month right prior to submission of the application. Okay. The current income and resource level for individuals is $875, and for a couple is $1,284. If it's that's most typical. Most clients that I work with is really not going to be more than 2 individuals who are applying. If there's a larger family, the limits do go up, but I always just quote the income resource levels for a single individual and a couple. The current resource level at the point of application is 15,750 for an individual, and a couple is 23,100.
Hector, do you want to touch on really what a resource is and explain just in general? Because I think we talk about what's exempt, but I don't know if we touch
Okay,
on what it
absolutely.
includes.
Absolutely. Resources, income is pretty straightforward. Income is usually Social Security, any distributions from an IRA, pensions, interest income, and resources are typically what monies you do have in the bank. If an individual who's applying for Medicaid does have an IRA, which is considered a qualified account, only the distribution is counted. The principal is not counted against them as a resource. Question always comes up with annuities. Annuities are very complex, and some annuities are considered qualified under IRS rules. Others are not. So a resource annuity under the resource category could have the entire amount in the annuity subject to be considered as a resource. Okay, exempt assets at the point of application. Primary residence up to an $893,000 equity cap. Most people are typically below this amount, so the primary resident is exempt from being counted against the individual who's applying. An automobile is not counted, and prepaid funeral services are now an exempt item. It used to be, many people years ago remember the $1,500 burial account that they would run out to their bank and establish. Those actually still are around, but today the recommendation is to go to your local funeral director and prepay funeral services. And the advantage to doing that is that you're locking in the cost of final arrangements at today's dollar. And these trusts actually do accrue benefits. People can borrow against the equity that's being gained on these prepaid funeral arrangements. Income producing properties, business assets, and life insurance is one area where Medicaid does look at. And if the face value of the policy or the cash value of the policy exceed the resource limits, it could impact the eligibility. So we do ask for the information on these policies and make a determination whether or not it's going to impact the application. The life insurance policies, individuals have choices to do this, and families have choices what to do on these policies. They can actually transfer the ownership of the policy, which surprises many individuals that they can do that, and but the beneficiary and those issues remain the same. Or you can cash out the policy and then do a prepaid burial or funeral service arrangements that we discussed.
I want to add too, also, I want to piggyback off what Hector is saying. The automobile exemption is one per person. So in the household, so if you have a couple, there's 2 automobiles, the value of those are exempt from the application. And also the prepaid burial and funeral services, the nice thing about that is you can actually prepay funeral services for your children or someone else. So sometimes when people have to spend some money down, this is one way that they can do it. And it's probably one of the only things that Medicaid would ever let you purchase for someone else and not count it against you. So that's something to always maybe think about keeping in your back pocket, that a good way to help spend your money down.
Okay.
So now we'll get into the rule changes.
Okay, now, what services are going to be impacted? As you see there, that the primary is going to be the home health care services. because of the 30-month look back period that's going to be, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But private duty nursing services will be impacted, personal care services. Let me kind of clarify this. There's actually in home care currently, there is the managed long-term care programs, which are essentially insurance programs. But those of you who are familiar with CASA in New York City particularly, those were the personal care services that are still around, which are commonly referred to as home attendants. And but that also will be impacted by the eligibility criteria. Assisted living programs, which are covered by Medicaid. And one of the major changes is the consumer-directed personal assistance program. The eligibility for the consumer directive to have a family member or someone that you are familiar with, a neighbor, so on, the eligibility for this program will change as well with the new changes in the Medicaid in New York State. And of course, the managed long-term care programs will be impacted greatly by the changes in Medicaid effective October 1st of this year. The biggest change that that's going to be occurring, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, most people who want to apply for Medicaid were always kind of asking about this look back period, and it really at that point in time would only be for nursing home eligibility. As of October 1st, there will be a 30-month look back for community-based Medicaid. So any transfers made within that 30-month look back will be subject to review by Medicaid, and they will be penalties in terms of when Medicaid eligibility would be established based on the transfers that would be made during that 30-month period. There are still exceptions to transfer penalties. Transfers to spouses are still allowed. Transfer to disabled children is still allowed, and transfers into supplemental needs trust will be allowed. The community service, the CSRA reduction to 74,820. In the past, it was approximately 128,000 and change. That's now being reduced, and that's under the spousal enrichment program.
And the one thing that about this is while transfers to a spouse are exempt, meaning if we own something joint and I need to get it out of my name because I'm going to apply for Medicaid, I can transfer it to my husband, but I can't load him up with all of our assets. We're limited now to about $75,000 in assets. So that's going to limit not only the money that will limit the assets that he can hold. So then a lot of people own more than $75,000 in assets. So that becomes a problem, what to do when you're over that amount. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk a little bit more about that after.
Yeah, and actually, Alyssa, there was a lot of infighting from what I understand when I was learning about these changes. The state wanted to reduce it to about $25,000. So we're lucky that at least it was kept at the $74,000 to $75,000 level. Yeah. So you imagine if it had gone down to $25,000, so it would have made things much even more complicated. One of the major changes besides the 30-month look back period is that how people are assessed for services is going to change radically. They're going to be looking at more the medically needy, and individuals who do not have Alzheimer's will have to meet certain standards in terms of needs for activities of daily life. In the past, although during the assessment period, the individual's needs were looked at, it was not as stringent as it's going to be. So that's going to be tightened up quite a bit. So individuals might not qualify for services that currently may be able to do so. And as I mentioned, most individuals who do not have Alzheimer's will have to be need services in 3 or more of activities of daily lives. And those with Alzheimer's will only need 2 or more ADLs. Um, Treatment plans, the applicant's doctor can no longer determine treatment needed. Instead, a qualified independent doctor will be used. This also makes the eligibility process very, very subjective. I recall in the past when I worked as a discharge planner in the hospitals, that when individuals were admitted and needed additional services, we would always call, we used to refer to them as the affiliate physicians who worked independently from the city, and typically was to come out and just really knock down any services that the individual may need and additional services. So we're facing that dilemma now in general, that these physicians are going to be independent and will really apply the rules much more strictly. And there's going to be a lot more challenges in terms of those that they do not find qualified. So these are some of the major changes that we're facing in October. As I mentioned, the medical currently when somebody applies for home care services under the MLTC programs, there is a UAS assessment that is done by the state under the New York Medicaid Choice Program, or Maximus, as some of us who work in the field are familiar with. That assessment process will be changed, and that's being developed now, and we don't know exactly how that's going to look. But again, it's going to be a much more independent process, which raises the subjectivity of how people will get services. And as we noted, there's going to be heightened standard, those receiving 12 or more hours of care a day. And this could, interestingly, force individuals who need more than 12 hours to go into a nursing home. And this is going to be some areas that are going to be really challenged for families who do not wish that for their loved ones, and prefer to have them remain in the community. Fortunately, spousal refusal, what remains the same? Fortunately, spousal refusal will remain. This spousal refusal, it seems to be always wants to be the sacrificial cow. Every year when there's budget reviews in New York State, they've been wanting to get rid of this for years. But fortunately, they maintain the spousal refusal option, which will hopefully allow individuals to become qualified for home care services.
There's a mistake on the next one.
Go ahead, Alyssa.
I said there's a mistake on the next one. It used to be that the CSRA allowance you could have between 74,000 and 128. Now it's just capped at 74,000.
Capped at 74,000. Yeah, exactly. Again, remember, we just touched on it. They wanted to reduce it down to roughly 25,000.
Yep.
So, but it's now at the 74,820 amount is listed there.
I will add to this, though, a lot of these changes, we don't know exactly how, when all of the rule changes go into effect, how will all this play out when applicants go and put their applications in, right? There's a lot of question marks over these things.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing with the spousal refusal, while right now the way it's currently set up, if I'm part of a married couple and my husband makes all the money, he can turn around and tell Medicaid that I love my wife, but I'm not going to spend my money to take care of her every month. And that's okay. That's allowed. One of the questions is, will the counties now go after my spouse to force him to chip in part of his income every month to my care? So historically, there's many counties in the state that don't do this. They do not go after the spouses that refuse to contribute. But now we don't know if they're going to change their attitude on that. So that's something that we'll see what happens. But it still would be considered a win for the family, because the state's going to pay a much lesser rate for services than someone would pay out of pocket. So even if they do try to recoup from the refusing spouse, we would think that it would be it would be at a lesser expense than what we'd have to pay out of our own pocket. So
Mhm.
I will say that's something that would be interesting to see how this plays out.
Yeah, and it's a good point, Alyssa. Historically, some counties are more aggressive than others prior to all these changes, and it's going to be interesting to see now if they all kind of lockstep with each other, and all the counties become aggressive in terms of coming after the refusing spouse.
Yeah. Hector, before you get into this, will you touch on what a pool trust is? Because I'm not sure how familiar everyone is that's on right now with what a pool trust is and how it works.
Sure, not a problem, Melissa. These pool trust actually the pool trusts are outside of the Medicaid realm. These became quite popular approximately, I would say, probably about at least 12 years ago. In the past, Medicaid in New York State was always been very, very generous to its applicants. And even though every year there was a different level of capping the income level, the individual could become eligible for Medicaid if they agreed to pay the difference. So currently, as indicated on the slide there, the 2020 level is 875 for an individual. So if your income was $1,875 prior to the existence of these pool trusts, the individual would have to pay that $1,000 difference either to the home care agency or to Medicaid. But with the pool trust, you can shelter that excess income as established by Medicaid, and it is an irrevocable trust that you arrange, and you're required to fund it on a monthly basis. But rather than turning over the excess income, you can use the income that's being deposited into the trust towards your paying for your living expenses. So that makes it much more beneficial for individuals to have a pool trust to shelter excess income and allow them to establish Medicaid eligibility, where in the past, most people didn't apply for Medicaid because they just says, how can I live on the Medicaid standard alone? Um, Annual recertifications will be handled. The new rules for recertification for existing applicants who establish eligibility under the old rules. You know, right now under the coronavirus, the Department of Social Services have extended the recertifications for the through next year. So if you have a recertification that's falls between these current months now, you do not need to renew your Medicaid. It will be done automatically until next year. This could change in June, but it depends on what's going to be happening with the coronavirus. What we don't know how long the review process will take under these new changes in October 1st. Currently, the regulations require the Department of Social Services to respond within 45 days of an application being submitted to the Department of Social Services. However, as you know, currently there is no look back period, but a look back period typically will probably add to the length of time the review process. No one's quite sure how this is going to impact eligibility, because if an individual is in need of services, this review process under the look back could add months to the application process, which no one's quite sure what this is going to look like going forward. I wanted to add as well that although these changes are to take place on October 1st, there's a possibility that the Department of Health may push these back for 3 months. And, and I'm sure there's going to be lawsuits brought up against the state and these changes, which might impact on pushing this back for further clarification, i.e. like the review process. Why someone should be penalized, that the review process is going to take much longer than it normally does now.
Hopefully we'll get it pushed back.
Yes.
So now we're going to talk about some planning strategies because normally when Hector and I are working with clients, under the old rules, it's much simpler for us to get someone qualified for home care now. We could basically do all this planning, transfer your assets into a Medicaid trust and today and apply tomorrow, and chances are you'd be eligible. But now all that's going to change. And with this 30-month look back period, it really is going to impact what we can do with our clients. So our biggest hurdle that we're going to have to be dealing with is our transfer penalties. And that basically means that if I have $100,000 in the bank and I want to qualify for Medicaid and I take that money and I put it in a Medicaid trust, or if Medicaid starts reviewing my bank account statements and they find that within the 30-month look back, I gave my daughter $50,000, they're going to look at that and say that's a disqualifying transfer and I can be assessed a penalty. And the penalties are determined in different ways depending on the county that you reside in. Because the cost of care is different depending where you live in the state of New York. I think it's about 12, Hector, it's about 12,000 and change, I think, in Manhattan.
Yes, it's going to vary from county to county, as it does now for institutional Medicaid. So someone for example, in the New York City area, for roughly the formula is for every $10,000 transferred, there'll be 1 month of ineligibility, and this is what they're going to be doing as well for the home care
Yeah.
piece, but it'll vary from locations within the state.
So let's say that I had $100,000 in the bank and I transferred that into a trust. Well, that means if we're going to say for every $10,000 is 1 month of 1 month of a nursing home stay, that means that I would have to private pay out of my own pocket for about 10 months of the nursing home before Medicaid will consider covering me. That's
Correct.
major for so many people, because if I had that money laying around in the first place where I could pay for my nursing home care or my home health care, I wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. So that's one of the biggest hurdles we're anticipating dealing with. And there are advanced Medicaid planning strategies, and I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of them because it probably will bore you and or confuse you. But there are a lot of ways that we can shelter assets to make them non-countable or lower your exposure of what maybe the transfer penalty that you would be experiencing is. So there are things out there that we can do. But I would say this, these are things that oftentimes we have to do in a crisis, and there's always a time to do pre-planning. So it's in everyone's best interest to consider to do pre-planning than to wait until the last minute. One thing that I get asked a lot is, well, what do I do in the meantime? If I do have a penalty period, how am I supposed to pay for my care and pay for my living expenses? And one thing, Hector and I were actually just discussing this earlier, one thing is to consider long-term care insurance. I know that long-term care insurance gets a really bad rap because it is so expensive, and I know that sometimes these carriers are difficult to deal with, but I would encourage people to look into it because a lot of these companies are changing their products to have them be more affordable, more user friendly. I know a lot of companies are combining them with life insurance policies to make them more usable to people. So maybe it's a life insurance policy that's building a cash value that will allow you to tap into it to pay for some of these long-term care costs that would bridge the gap. If you are sitting on a 10-month penalty period, you'll have the peace of mind that the funds are there to pay for it, to pay for your care until your Medicaid would kick in. So I would say that that is one thing to consider. There are other estate planning techniques that we use to help fund care, but always, insurance is always a great way to have peace of mind. married couples, I think married couples have a little bit more of an advantage because of spousal refusal and the community spouse resource allowance. I think that it might be a little bit easier for us to do planning when someone is married than when it's just an individual. So we talked about spousal refusal before. That's when a spouse can refuse to turn over assets or their income to support the person who's applying. And we're going to keep our fingers crossed that the counties won't go after that refusing spouse to chip in for the care. But also, while they did limit how much the non-applicant spouse can keep out of the assets, we do still have $74,000 that we could hold on to. And Hector, they're still allowed to have the 15,000 for, I think it's 500 now.
Right,
The
15,
applicant spouse.
5750, right, that doesn't change.
So on top of this, an individual applying for Medicaid can have resources of about $15,400. So that's in addition to the 75,000. So now you're really up to 90,000 if you think about it. So taking advantage of every little bit that we can get from Medicaid is something that we plan to take advantage of. So what do we do now, right? That's what I get asked a lot. Every day that goes by, that runway gets smaller and smaller between here and October 1st, and we're all kind of holding our breath to see what happens. But I can say that if you are on the verge of needing care now and you're on the border, then it is really in your best interest to apply before October 1st, because there's so many things that we could do now to protect any assets that you have and qualify you for Medicaid under the old rules, which are much more lenient than what we're looking at later this year. So again, if you're on the verge of needing care, you really should consider applying now. The other thing is always to get ahead of the curve and try to avoid a crisis. So that's why I talk about pre-planning. And that could look like a number of different ways for people, depending on what type of assets you own, what kind of income you have, depending on your situation. But one of the biggest things that we use when we're working with clients to protect their assets is a Medicaid asset protection trust. I'm sure many people have heard of this, not really sure exactly what it is, but it's an asset that helps you shield you. It's a trust that helps you shield your assets and your income so you can preserve it for your family or your spouse, and then also keeping it out of the reach of Medicaid, because legally your trust owns these assets now and technically you don't anymore. So it's not your asset, so they can't count it against you. And within 30 months of creating that trust, you will now be those assets will be fully exempt for Medicaid. So a lot of times, when you're planning for your long-term care, it might be a good idea to set up this trust if you know that maybe within the next 5 years I'll need care. And it's a good idea to transfer your assets into the trust to preserve them, and then you can wait out the 30 months, and then you'd be in the clear for when you need home care. And then also, maybe you anticipate a nursing home stay later on down the line. That is a 60-month look back period. So it's always best to set up these trusts before you need the care, so you can start that clock running down for the 30 or the 60 months when you may need care later on, because we never know when we might have a sudden illness, and that we might need greater care. I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So before we wrap this up, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. I know that Medicaid is a really complicated area. There's a lot of things happening at the same time. It's really hard to keep up with sometimes. I know when Hector and I meet with our clients, we go on and on about Medicaid is, and they look at us like they have no idea what we were talking about. So I would encourage everyone that if it is something that you are considering planning for your long-term care, that it is probably worth maybe setting up a consultation and talking to Hector and I about what exactly would this process look like for me and my spouse, or just yourself if you're not married. because it's not a cookie cutter situation. It's not a one size fits all plan. It really is based on the assets and the income that you have and really what you're looking to achieve. A lot of people want to be at home and have their care at home, and some people know that maybe based on their medical needs that they need it, and they, the safest place is a nursing home. So again, I think considering setting up a consultation to talk to us, Hector and we walk our clients through this planning process together. I handle all the estate planning services, and Hector does the application. He does the assessment coordinations, helps with the pool trust. So we team up and do this together, and help walk our clients through this. I do have someone here that has their hand raised, so I'm going to unmute you if I can remember how. Hold on. Oh, I don't know how to do it. Why isn't it working? I see you, Diane, but I can't. Oh, I don't think your audio is working, or it's not on. If you can send your message to the chat, Hector and I can answer you. And if anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you. No other questions. Diane, it won't let me unmute you. I don't think, for some reason, it's showing you're not connected. But if you want to email me offline and I could help answer any questions you may have. At the end, let's see. Well, if you want more information about my law firm, or you can follow us on Facebook, LinkedIn, we're all over the place. This is also how you contact us. If there was a question that we did not get to, or maybe you needed some clarification on something, please feel free to email me, call me, I'm very responsive. You can also find out more about our firm on the web. That's our URL. If you're also going to get a link after this is over, you'll get a thank you email with a link to my calendar if you want to set up a consultation to talk about estate planning, Medicaid planning, anything elder law or estate planning related. I'm definitely here to help you. This is actually the last part of a 3-part series that I've had over about the past 6 weeks. The first 2 webinars are listed on my website, www.monteleonelaw.com. If you click the resources tab, you will see the other 2 webinars are posted there. I will add this one too. So if you want to go back and listen to it again, feel free to. And if you have any questions, feel free to email or call. And that's all we have for tonight. Hector, is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unknowns certainly going forth, but together we'll kind of get through this process, and there's still a lot of tools that we can utilize to establish the Medicaid eligibility, and hopefully kind of being an optimist here, that whatever litigation is established against these changes, maybe we can, reduce the impact that's going to happen in October, or at least push it back a little more into 2021, and thus allow us to plan a little bit more for eligibility for Medicaid.
Yeah, I am hoping that this is such a cluster that it works to our advantage to buy ourselves some more time to get the clients who really are in urgent need of services through this process. But a lot of us are just holding our breath to see how this plays out, and a lot of it we won't know until we actually get the applications in and fight our way through. And I will add this, a lot of Medicaid planning and working with clients is about advocacy. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and it's not just filling out the application and sending it off to HRA or DSS and seeing what happens. There's a lot of communication between Hector and I with those offices, and it's really it's important to always be in control of the narrative with them, because they're always going to be wanting some other piece of information, some clarification, some explanation. So it's definitely a lot that goes into it. It's only going to get harder. But like Hector said, being optimistic, looking at the silver lining, there are still plenty of things that we can do to help our clients qualify for for the care that they need and they are entitled to. It's really not, I don't think anyone should have to work their whole life to acquire an asset, then to have to spend it down to get help with activities of daily living. So there, I will say there's definitely still a lot we can do, but if you do think you're on the verge of needing care, it definitely is in your interest to get to do something now about it, because we do have the time left to get in under the old rules and not have to complicate things if we don't have to. I'm going to check one more time for questions. I don't see any others. So Hector, do you have anything else? Any
No,
last?
no, I think that was it. I'm glad I had this opportunity to present. We're all learning through these new changes here, and I think keep in mind too. I think the local DSSs and so on are just going to be scratching their heads as well, because the major changes as for us as advocates, it will be also for the Department of Social Services figuring all of this out.
Oh, I have one question. Hold on, let me unmute them. I'm every time I do this, I discover extra panes in my control panel. So I just discovered a new one where I had a question. So hold on one sec. All right, Denise, I just unmuted you. Go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to say that I recommended Alyssa to a friend of mine because she was having a lot of difficulty with her mother and getting some assistance through Medicaid. And I have to say on her behalf, she was so grateful. She said that Alyssa, Hector, I don't know if you worked on that with Alyssa, but
He did.
she said
Okay.
she was very grateful and very appreciative because without your help, she would not have been able to achieve what she achieved for her mom, and just couldn't say enough good things about it, which was great. I was really happy. It's hard when you refer someone to someone else. You always, say, gee, I hope this works out, and it worked out wonderfully. So I really appreciate it, and I just wanted to give you a testimonial on her behalf.
I appreciate that. That's the one
Thank
thing
you.
about Medicaid planning. Hector and I hold our breath all the way through the whole process. And because you never know. We know what the rules are. We know what we need to do for our clients, but dealing with Medicaid, they're not always in the same realm of logical reasoning that everyone else is. So you never know what you're going to get. You never know who's going to pick up that case and review it. So to hear those positive things on the other end of it really makes it all worthwhile. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
No problem.
All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Like I said, you're going to get a thank you email for joining us tonight. You will have access to my calendar if you want to set up a consultation. I do not charge.
Alyssa, I think you froze.
Oh, I'm
There you
here.
go. Okay.
Oh, all right, I'm going to end it. All right. Thank you.